Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the EU07 locomotive over here in SimRail, the railway simulator. Now this is a really unique locomotive. Taking a look at it, you can kind of tell its age just by getting a good look at it. It is an electric locomotive, very capable, very quick. It's got a couple little kind of weird quirks to it. Now we're going to kind of show those quirks off to you today. The first one being, by the way, all these switches work in case you're curious, is our handy dandy drive handle. Now you'll notice that if I just take this and crank it to position 1, you'll see I'll start pulling some amperage and I'll start accelerating gently. You also notice as I start cranking through my different throttle positions that it actually shows that I've got orange throttle. What's the deal with that? Well, let me show you. Keep tapping this. Again, I'm going to keep my current under 600, by the way, if you're under 28. And once you get to throttle position 28, you'll notice it turns green. Now, the reason for that is because this is a non-resistive throttle position. If you want to think about it another way, if you think about your stereo for a moment, when you're cranking up the volume, think of this as basically, if you crank down the volume, all that energy's got to go somewhere, kind of a thing like that. So when you're not in position 28, or if I'm going to crank it hard, position 43, you're actually you're basically resisting the power and generating an awful lot of heat. So when they designed this locomotive, they tried to design it in such a way that those two settings were kind of your cruise settings, and all the rest of them were kind of your general acceleration settings. Now, to make things more complicated, there's this little handle on the back called a shunt regulator. Now, the shunt regulator, I always think of kind of like a boost handle. So if I give itself one shunt, you'll notice my amperage jumps quite considerably. If I give it a couple shunts here, you can see I can actually really bring on the amps here. By the way, if you cross the 1200 mark there, that's going to put you in a really bad spot because, of course, you're going to pop the breaker. Now, on this particular locomotive, if you do pop the breaker, there's a little button down here. Shut your motors all the way to 0, then click this one right here to go ahead and disengage it. By the way, this is a multiplayer scenario if you were curious. And if you're wondering why I have a 6-minute delay, I inherited that. So, unfortunately, that's one of the downsides to operating this one. Other things you need to keep an eye out on this locomotive is that we have 3 different instruments, all different basic critical ones here. This one's going to be for our locomotive brake. This is going to be our reservoir, and of course, in the end, you have the train brake as well. Now, I see I'm getting really close to 120 kph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out my shunt regulator here, put it to 0, and we're going to coast up to 120 and see how close we can get to it. Now, there's 120 right now. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring my throttle, that's shift minus, by the way, and then numpad. And I'm actually going to bring in a couple of the shunts here. Again, the shunts can be used in position 28 or 43. You can't do the shunts in other positions. And by doing so, what I've essentially done is I'm maintaining my 120 in the proper position without dealing with any kind of consequences as far as the operation goes. Again, you can see I'm sitting here at shunt 4 and throttle 28. Now, the real one, apparently what I was reading, is that this is actually interlocked. I shouldn't really be able to manipulate that too much beyond those settings. Oop. I don't know why that's worth 50 points. The penalty for not doing it is worth a lot. Now, you notice here I'm doing about 119. I'm actually slowing down. So there's a couple different ways we can solve this. So I can pop out the shunts, and I can crank this back into position 43, and you can see that gave me a pretty good amount of amps here. And, of course, you hear all the bang behind me of all the solenoids clicking in. And you can actually see as we're starting to transition uphill here that I'm going to have to bring in a little bit more of that shunt in order to give us that extra bit of juice to go it in. Next item that I can see is we have a signal coming up here. It's at 2.5 kilometers. We also have a 100. Slowing this train down pretty easy, except for the fact I'm a big passenger train here. So we don't have regenerative brakes or anything like that. So unfortunately, we got to do this thing the hard way when it comes down to slowing it. Blast through the station. Bonk, bonk. How y'all doing? I cannot pronounce the names of any of these things. I feel so bad, but it's kind of that piece. So in this particular locomotive, there are no regenerative brakes. So one of the things we get on a lot of the American locomotives is, you can throw it into Regen 2 or you can throw it into Regen 3 or something like that, or depending on which locomotive it is. I'm actually going to pull it out. That's enough. And you can see we're actually starting to transition downhill here. Little blue light on the left simply says that it's ready. So go ahead and pop in a little tiny reduction of brakes. Again, a little bit. The trick here is you want to get kind of slow, usually about 117, like 3 or 4 under. Then I'm going to go ahead and pop that back into the running position, and I'm basically going to let that come out. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the brake release button. That's basically going to get rid of all of the pressure that we have up in the locomotive here. You can see that needle's all dropped itself down to 0. And then we're just going to allow, see what I mean? There's 10 points for missing a warning signal. That's because I'm looking at everyone but out the window. And now we can go ahead and bring the power back in here. We were going down for just a second. We're still kind of going down a little bit. I'll go ahead and bring on the power again. Remember, you cannot exceed 600 amps under 28. And you can't exceed 1200 amps over 28 here. What I don't want to do, and this is what I'm kind of hoping I'm avoiding here, is blasting right through the 120 because we start going downhill again. Again, unlike other sims that are like this game, there is no little indicator on here which tells me what my current grade is. Basically, you have to kind of do the think system sort of thing, or as my buddy would say, TLAR. It's saying, that looks about right. We got a speed limit going down 100 in a second, so I'm actually going to go ahead and start my reduction. One of the great pieces of advice I was given by an engineer at one point is he was saying you can do anything on 10 pounds of pressure, and what he's referring to is the actual braking action itself. So we're going to come down again. Speeding is considered anything 4 over. Yeah, we're going to speed. We're going to speed. Oh, we sped for like a second, though. Notice, by the way, we left the throttle in during that. We did a little tiny bit of power braking. The purpose of power braking, if you're curious, by the way, is it's basically going to give you the ability to stretch the train out as you approach a particular point. So I'm going to go ahead and bail off our locomotive brake there. And I said we're on about 100, which is pretty good. I'm going to crank my throttle. We'll come back up to throttle position 28 there. Give it just a moment. Now, we have a stop coming up here. It's a 1.16. And that's more than enough. I'm actually going to cut that out, and we'll get ready on the braking. Now, the braking for me coming into a station is kind of two-parters. I'm actually going to do an initial reduction now. The reason being is that we're starting to go downhill again. Two-parter. There's first kind of the initial, and then, of course, I like the secondary here. You can see the station. It's always easier to brake when you can see where you need to go. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this to, I guess you want to call that about 9 o'clock position there. And one of the annoying prongs with this program is the station doesn't start until they say it starts. Like, I know that sounds silly, but you'll see what I mean. Didn't count. Go ahead and bring in a couple extras. And notice it still says I'm approaching the station. Go ahead and start coming off the pressure. Tail the locomotive. And we're here. Ding. And that's it. So, which you probably saw, a couple different things there. We came with our initial reduction, applied a little extra to kind of help slow it down, and again, we've got only 10 seconds at the station. Remember, when you're stopped, you always want to have a certain amount of pressure in. You don't want to be leaving the pressure out. If you see yourself starting to roll backwards, you done goofed up. So I can see that I've got about 2 seconds released. I'll go ahead and start bringing out some of the pressure here. And we'll just go through the acceleration process on this locomotive. So the way I like to do this, of course, we'll go ahead and cancel that out. We're going to stretch the train out gently. So I'm going to go ahead and get this going. Once I see it start to roll a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly start to increase the current here. And we're just going to be going through all the resisted throttle settings initially, and then we're going to be moving up to the other settings. Now, again, different ways to do this. The shunt's really a fun way to kind of play with it, depending on sort of what you're doing on a given scenario. If you have a big, heavy cargo train, you're almost always going to be using the shunts a lot. If you have a little passenger train like this one, it's not really little. It's a pretty good-sized train, not going to lie. If you have a pretty long consist like what we have here, you're probably going to be using, again, the same kind of procedure here, depending on what you want to do. Now, notice, by the way, when I went from 28 to 29, that my current jumps. That's because of the way the motors are wired, going from series to parallel mode. So we get like a little extra kind of kick here. You want to be kind of careful, especially with this wet. There's a pretty good probability that we're going to slip. And if you do slip, there's this little white light that's going to come flicking on here. Let's see if we can get all the way up here. Nice, we got it. Now, if I was being extra aggressive, again, you can start popping in those shunts. And each one of those is going to get you a good solid 150 amps here. So really try your hardest to not exceed the 1200 limit or to cause everything to slip. So as you can see, this is an absolutely wild locomotive. There's a tutorial that they actually give you in-game, which will walk you through what all the other switches do and all kind of these buttons. But for the actual driving operation, which is the purpose of this video, hopefully I've showed you kind of what goes into it, sort of the different tricks I like to use with it that makes it work. But it takes practice. Like, you'll be really surprised, especially if you're dealing with a really big, heavy, long train. This thing does have the power to pull the big stuff, but don't be surprised if it's a little difficult to operate, especially when it comes to releasing the brakes. Once you put those brakes in, yeah, it's a project to get rid of the pressure that they build. Other than that, enjoy.